Power without purpose leads to downfall. Throughout history, power has often been the ultimate pursuit of kings, politicians, empires, and even modern influencers. But the truth is, power in itself is neutral. It's neither good nor evil. What determines the impact of power is the purpose that drives it. Power without purpose is like a vehicle without a driver. It may move fast, it may make noise, but ultimately it is dangerous, directionless, and doomed to crash. When individuals ascend to positions of authority, influence, or control without a deep understanding of asterisk, why asterisk, they are there without a cause greater than themselves to serve. Their leadership becomes fragile. Their decisions become reactionary. Their vision narrows. Their concern drifts from what is right to what is beneficial for themselves. They begin to build not for the people, but for their own image. And over time, what was once celebrated as strength reveals itself as insecurity cloaked in charisma. Purpose is what anchors power. Without it, the leader forgets who they are meant to serve. Power becomes a mirror, constantly asking, "How do I look?" rather than a window asking, "Who can I help?" When the pursuit of leadership turns inward, it ceases to be leadership at all. It becomes tyranny dressed in the robes of legitimacy. This is why many seemingly powerful leaders fall, suddenly, shockingly, and completely. They may have had every resource, every ally, every outward sign of dominance, and yet they crumbled. Why? Because they were standing on a platform built not on purpose, but on ego, and ego is the weakest of foundations. It cracks under pressure, it warps in isolation, and it cannot hold the weight of responsibility. History does not remember those who held power the longest. It remembers those who used it the most meaningfully. Power, for its own sake, leaves no legacy. Power with purpose creates movements, nations, revolutions, and generations of transformation. Martin Luther King Jr. had far less institutional power than many leaders of his day, but his purpose, deeply rooted in justice, faith, and love, gave his voice a power that outlasted laws and shook empires. In contrast, many rulers with armies, wealth, and governments behind them have faded into obscurity because their power served only themselves. The danger of power without purpose is not just personal, it is systemic. Organizations, nations, and institutions begin to mirror the emptiness of their leaders. Without a guiding why, policies are made to protect positions, not people. Innovation stalls. Morale drops. Corruption creeps in, slowly at first, then rapidly as the absence of purpose creates a vacuum that self-interest rushes to fill. People sense it. They lose trust. They become disengaged or disillusioned. And eventually, whether by choice or force, the structure begins to fall apart. Purpose, on the other hand, brings clarity. When a leader knows why they are there, when they are driven not by the need to be seen, but by the need to serve, they become unshakable. Challenges don't deter them because their goal isn't comfort, it's impact. Criticism doesn't destroy them because their identity isn't tied to applause. They don't need to cling to power because they never saw it as theirs to begin with. They are stewards, not owners, and stewardship is sustainable in a way that control can never be. Even in spiritual terms, power without purpose is condemned. Throughout the Scriptures, God consistently raises and removes leaders, not based on their popularity, but based on their alignment with divine purpose. Saul was chosen, but he lost sight of his calling. He began to use his power to protect his own status, not to fulfill his sacred duty, and so he was replaced, not because he was weak, but because he had become detached from the why behind his role. David, flawed as he was, carried a heart aligned with purpose. He wasn't perfect, but he was rooted in something bigger than himself. In modern times, we often celebrate success as a function of size, visibility, or dominance. But real leadership that lasts, is measured by intention. It is purpose that breathes life into power. Without it, power becomes hollow. It becomes a tool for manipulation rather than transformation, a throne rather than a table, a sword rather than a seed. One of the clearest signs that power has lost its purpose is when a leader starts to fear the people they lead. They stop listening, they isolate. They surround themselves with flatterers instead of truth, tellers. Their world shrinks to an echo chamber, and in that echo chamber they begin to mistake their voice for the voice of God, their comfort for righteousness, their position for destiny. But destiny is never sustained by arrogance. It is sustained by alignment with truth, service, and calling. When a leader is aligned with purpose, their power becomes a conduit. It flows through them. It uplifts others, it builds bridges, it heals, it outlasts them, and often it grows stronger when they step aside, because they built something rooted in meaning, not personality. Contrast that with power rooted in self. It fights to hold on. It silences dissent. It demands loyalty instead of earning trust, and in doing so, it sows the seeds of its own destruction. It becomes so focused on survival that it forgets its original mission, if it ever had one. And eventually, it collapses under the weight of its own false sense of permanence. We should never be surprised when purposeless power fails. We should be surprised it lasted as long as it did. The collapse is not the tragedy. The tragedy is how long people suffer under its illusion. Because every day that power is misused, people pay the price. They lose hope. They lose faith in leadership. They become cynical, and cynicism is hard to heal, but it can be healed. When we reintroduce purpose into positions of power, things change. It starts with asking hard questions. Asterisk, why am I here? What is this power for? Who does it serve? And what happens when I'm gone? Asterisk, these questions aren't weaknesses. They are the compass of real leadership. Because when power is divorced from purpose, it does not remain static. It decays, it corrupts. It destabilizes not just the leader, but the environment around them. Families, churches, governments, companies, none are immune. The outward form may remain for a time, but the soul is gone, and eventually the emptiness becomes visible. True leadership is sustained by humility and integrity. Leadership is often misunderstood. Too frequently, it's equated with dominance, charisma, or control. We see strong voices, large followings, and assume these are the marks of a true leader. But real leadership, lasting, transformative leadership, is built on something quieter, deeper, and far less glamorous: humility and integrity. These are the invisible forces that sustain influence when everything else fades. They are the foundations that hold when the storms come. Humility is not weakness. It is not timidity or a lack of confidence. It is strength under control. It is the clear understanding that leadership is not about being above others, but being among them and often beneath them in service. The humble leader does not need to prove their authority through loudness or force. Their presence speaks because their actions align with truth. They listen, they learn, they admit mistakes, and in doing so, they earn something no title can secure: trust. Trust is the currency of leadership. Without it, authority becomes a shell, an empty role people obey but no longer believe in. Trust is not given freely. It is built little by little through consistency and character, and nothing builds trust like integrity. Integrity is wholeness. It is living and leading in a way where words and actions match, where values are not just stated but lived. It is doing what is right when no one is watching. It is choosing long-term faithfulness over short-term gain. Humility and integrity are inseparable. Humility allows a leader to recognize they don't know everything, and integrity ensures they don't pretend to. Humility keeps the ego in check, while integrity keeps ambition in line. Together, they form the inner architecture of a leader who is both approachable and dependable. And in a world that often celebrates the opposite, these qualities become not only rare, but revolutionary. Leadership without humility becomes tyranny. It becomes obsessed with control, allergic to criticism, and addicted to approval. Leaders who lack humility fear transparency because they fear exposure. They surround themselves with yes men instead of truth tellers. They trade honest feedback for hollow praise. Over time, their view narrows, their empathy fades, and they lead from isolation instead of connection. That isolation breeds insecurity, and insecurity in leadership is dangerous. It causes overreactions, harsh judgments, impulsive decisions. It drives leaders to defend their position at all costs, even when the cost is people. But the humble leader is different. They are not threatened by the strengths of others. They invite collaboration, not because they lack answers, but because they believe leadership is a team sport. They do not shrink from difficult conversations. They enter them with grace and with an open hand. Their posture is not "I know," but "let's discover together." And this creates a culture of growth, not fear. People feel safe around humble leaders, not because those leaders are soft, but because they are grounded. Grounded leadership inspires. It doesn't manipulate. It doesn't need to elevate itself by lowering others. It is secure enough to step back so others can step forward. It is confident enough to give credit away. This kind of leadership multiplies itself because it is not built on one person's image. It's built on shared purpose and values. Integrity gives that humility roots. Without integrity, humility becomes a performance. But with integrity, humility becomes a way of life. Leaders with integrity are not swayed by popularity or pressured by trends. They know who they are. Their inner world matches their outer world. They say no when it's unpopular and yes when it's risky because they are guided by conviction, not convenience. This is not easy. In fact, it's often costly, but it is also freeing. When a leader leads with integrity, they don't have to manage a double life. They don't have to remember lies or juggle contradictions. They can rest, knowing their leadership is real. This kind of leadership is sustainable. It lasts because it doesn't depend on charisma, manipulation, or external validation. Those things fade, they tire, they wear thin under pressure. But integrity and humility gain strength in adversity. When scandals hit, when storms come, when the spotlight fades, leaders with these traits remain standing. Not because they were perfect, but because they were real. They didn't lead with a mask. They didn't chase applause. They pursued truth, and people can feel the difference. Followers don't just want powerful leaders. They want honest ones. They want to know the person leading them is human, aware of their flaws, and committed to doing the right thing even when it's hard. They want someone who won't throw them under the bus to protect themselves, who will speak the truth even when it hurts, and who leads not for their own sake, but for the good of those they serve. Integrity and humility are not just personal virtues, they are cultural forces. When a leader embodies them, they create environments where others do the same. A team led with integrity becomes trustworthy. A community led with humility becomes resilient. The tone is set from the top. If a leader gossips, the team gossips. If a leader cuts corners, the culture follows. But if a leader tells the truth, takes responsibility, and lifts others up, that example echoes through the entire organization. This is why humility and integrity are not optional in leadership. They are essential. Without them, power corrupts, influence decays, structures rot from the inside out. We've seen it too many times. Leaders with great ability but little character, rising fast and falling hard. Their downfall doesn't start with one decision. It starts with small compromises, a skipped truth here, a bent rule there, a justified lie. Eventually, the gap between image and reality grows too wide to manage, and the collapse becomes inevitable. The alternative is slow, quiet, and often unseen, but it is secure. It is the kind of leadership that builds not just success, but significance, not just results, but respect, not just growth, but goodness. It is leadership that knows every decision, every interaction, every small act of honesty or apology or listening builds something far greater than a moment of power. It builds legacy. Legacy is not built in spotlight moments. It is built in backroom decisions. It is built in how leaders treat the least powerful around them. It is built in how they respond when no one's watching, how they handle failure, how they share credit and shoulder blame. These are the tests of leadership that reveal whether a person is leading from a foundation of humility and integrity, or merely performing for approval and control. Many leaders start well. They begin with passion, vision, clarity. But over time, the temptation to protect image rather than integrity creeps in. The pressure to appear strong overrides the call to be honest, and slowly they begin to drift, not from their position, but from their purpose. That drift is hard to see because it happens in private, but eventually it becomes public, and by the time it's visible, it's often too late. That's why humility and integrity are not one-time decisions. They are daily choices. They are muscles that must be exercised. Every time a leader admits fault instead of shifting blame, they strengthen integrity. Every time they ask for input instead of pretending to know it all, they strengthen humility. These are not flashy moments, but they are foundational, and over time, they build something unshakable. When leaders lead from humility and integrity, they are not dependent on power to validate them. Their identity is not tied to their title. They can walk away without crumbling. They can hand over authority without losing themselves, because they were never leading for themselves in the first place. They were leading out of a deeper calling, a truer sense of purpose, and that kind of leadership cannot be removed by votes, scandals, or shifting tides. Removal from power can be divine correction, not destruction. When someone in power is removed, abruptly or slowly, publicly or quietly, the world often reacts with shock, confusion, or even celebration. Some see it as a collapse. Others see it as karma. But there is a deeper lens through which to view such moments, one that transcends headlines and political narratives. Sometimes removal from power is not the end of a story or the failure of a person, but a divine course correction. It is a signal that something in the foundation was off, and that the structure, however impressive, needed to be reset. Correction, in the divine sense, is never about humiliation for its own sake. It is about alignment. It is a call back to purpose, to truth, and to humility. Power is a stewardship, not a possession. Those entrusted with it are accountable not only to the people they serve, but to the higher calling that granted them the role. When that accountability is abandoned, When a leader begins to use power for personal preservation instead of public service, or when they drift from the principles that justified their rise, correction becomes necessary. This correction can come in many forms: circumstances turning, influence waning, opportunities closing, or systems shifting. But behind it all, if we are paying attention, we can often discern the hand of something greater moving, rebalancing, setting right what has gone wrong. In many ancient texts and traditions, including Scripture, the rise and fall of leaders is not attributed solely to political tides or popular opinion. It is often framed as a spiritual response. Leaders are raised up to fulfill a purpose. When that purpose is fulfilled, or when the leader ceases to serve it, they are removed, not as punishment, but as part of a greater unfolding plan. Saul, the first king of Israel, is a striking example. He was chosen, anointed, and empowered, but over time pride eclipsed obedience. His decisions began to reflect fear of man rather than fear of God, and so, despite still wearing the crown, his authority was spiritually revoked long before it was politically taken. His removal was not merely about failure. It was about preserving the mission that his leadership could no longer support. This pattern is repeated throughout history. People ascend to power with noble intent, often marked by vision, clarity, and public support. But over time, the weight of leadership tests character. If humility erodes, if integrity is compromised, if the leader becomes more committed to the preservation of their platform than to the people they lead, then what once was a divine appointment can become a divine liability. The leader no longer carries the mission. They carry only the mantle, and in such moments removal becomes a mercy, not only for the people, but for the leader themselves. It is a mercy because unchecked power disconnected from purpose corrodes the soul. It traps the leader in a cycle of performance, fear, and self-deception. They become surrounded by those who only echo their voice, and the distance between their public image and their private reality grows dangerously wide. Correction, then, is a way of breaking the illusion. It is a forced pause, a spiritual stop sign, a moment that demands reflection and repentance. To see removal from power as divine correction is not to dismiss the pain or fallout that may follow. It is not to ignore the consequences of poor leadership or to excuse harm done. Rather, it is to understand that even in the unraveling there can be redemption. The fall of a leader does not have to be the fall of the people. It does not have to be the end of a mission. It can be the beginning of a new chapter, one more aligned with truth, humility, and justice. For those watching from the outside, it can be tempting to judge quickly, to assign blame or cast stones, but divine correction is not about public shaming. It is about divine order. It is a reminder that no one is above accountability, and that leadership is not a birthright, it is a calling. When the calling is forsaken, the position may remain for a time, but the authority is already gone. Correction steps in to resolve that dissonance. It is the moment when reality catches up with truth. This perspective also offers hope. If removal from power is seen solely as destruction, then those who fall are written off completely. But if it is seen as correction, then there is space for restoration. Not necessarily to the same position, but to the original purpose. The removal is not the final word. It is the beginning of a return to values, to clarity, to dependence on something higher. In this way, divine correction is deeply compassionate. It does not discard, it redirects. Many leaders throughout history have found their greatest clarity not at the height of power, but in its loss. In the wilderness, in exile, in obscurity, they rediscovered what leadership meant. They remembered why they started. They shed the pride and pressure that had distorted their vision. and in some cases they were called back, not to reclaim power, but to serve more purely, more wisely. Others were never reinstated, but they lived out their days with greater peace and purpose than they had ever known in the palace. For the community around a fallen leader, the season of correction is also a test. Will they replicate the dysfunction of the past, or will they rebuild with greater wisdom? Will they seek another powerful figure to fill the gap, or will they pause long enough to ask deeper questions about values, systems, and accountability? Divine correction is never just about one individual. It is an invitation for collective reflection. It is a chance to realign the culture with its calling. Correction can feel like loss. It often comes with grief, with uncertainty, with the unraveling of what once felt secure. But it is also a birth, a sacred interruption, a clearing of what no longer serves so that something truer can emerge. It is uncomfortable, but it is necessary, and when we resist it, we prolong the dysfunction. When we embrace it, we open ourselves to healing, not just of the leader, but of the entire structure they influenced. The way we respond to the removal of a leader reveals our understanding of leadership itself. If we idolize individuals, their fall feels like chaos. But if we honor principles over personalities, their fall becomes a sobering but sacred transition. It reminds us that the mission is always bigger than the man or woman leading it. That leadership is a role, not an identity, and that no one is indispensable. Leaders who understand this lead with open hands. They know their time is temporary. They steward their role rather than cling to it. And when the season changes, they release it, not in bitterness, but in trust. Trust that the same force that raised them up will raise up others. Trust that correction is not rejection, it is refinement. This mindset changes everything. It turns removal from something to fear into something to understand. It allows us to see beyond the scandal, beyond the noise, beyond the headlines. It invites us to look at the heart of the matter, to ask, where did we lose our way? What needs to be recentered? What truth has been neglected? These are not easy questions, but they are essential ones. When a leader is removed and we see it only as a fall, we miss the opportunity. But when we see it as divine correction, we begin to ask what can be learned, what can be healed, and what can be built differently. We stop placing all our hope in flawed individuals and begin to anchor it in enduring values. We stop looking for saviors and start seeking servants. We recognize that power is not the point, purpose is. Correction in the hands of the divine is never wasted. It is precise, it is timely, and it is ultimately redemptive. It may feel like the end, but it is often the beginning of something far more aligned with truth. It removes not just people, but illusions. It brings hidden things to light. And in doing so, it creates space for a deeper kind of leadership to rise, one that is rooted in integrity, shaped by humility, and guided by a calling that no position can give or take away. Influence without accountability invites collapse. In any sphere where influence grows, be it in leadership, culture, politics, business, or even personal relationships, there is a gravitational pull toward insulation. People begin to defer to the one with influence. Their words carry more weight, their decisions go unchallenged. The influence, which once may have been rooted in a noble cause or deep conviction, begins to evolve into something else, something untethered, something more about the person than the purpose. And without accountability to keep that influence grounded, what was once a force for good becomes a structure vulnerable to collapse. Influence is powerful. It has the ability to inspire movements, transform communities, and reshape the future, but it is also dangerous when left unchecked. The more influence a person gains, the more essential accountability becomes. Not because they are necessarily corrupt or flawed, but because no one is immune to self, deception. No one is beyond the reach of pride or the slow drift into entitlement. Influence creates echo chambers, and in those chambers, voices that challenge or confront are often silenced, not always by force, but by irrelevance. The influential figure becomes the central voice, and slowly, truth becomes relative to their perspective. Accountability, then, is the safeguard. It is the mirror that shows leaders what they may not see themselves. It is the conversation that says, "You're drifting," when the room is filled with applause. It is the difficult question asked in private before public failure exposes the lack of alignment. Without it, leaders grow blind spots. Blind spots become blind arrogance, and arrogance, left to grow, always leads to collapse. The nature of collapse is rarely instant. It builds, little compromises are made, corners are cut, standards are lowered. The justification is always the same: "I've earned this," or "I'm doing this for a greater good." But over time, those compromises compound. What was once unthinkable becomes normal. What was once sacred becomes strategic. The person of influence begins to bend truth to serve their narrative rather than conform their life to truth. And without accountability, there is no one to interrupt that drift. History is filled with leaders and influencers who rose quickly, captured the attention and loyalty of many, and eventually fell, not because of a lack of vision or skill, but because accountability was removed from their orbit. Their inner circle was filled with agreement rather than challenge. Loyalty became synonymous with silence, and over time, influence hardened into entitlement. The same platform that once allowed them to serve others became a throne from which they demanded allegiance. And when the collapse came, it shocked the world, but had long been inevitable to anyone paying attention to the lack of guardrails. There is a common belief that accountability limits freedom, that to be questioned or challenged is somehow an obstacle to leadership. But the opposite is true. Accountability is what makes real freedom possible. It keeps influence clean. It prevents power from becoming manipulation. It allows leaders to make decisions with clarity rather than from impulse or insecurity. It's not a leash, it's a compass. It doesn't bind the leader, it orients them. True accountability is not merely institutional. It's not just about having a board or a policy manual. It's relational. It's built on trust and truth. It comes from people who are close enough to see behind the curtain, courageous enough to speak when it's uncomfortable, and respected enough to be heard. Without these people, the leader begins to live in isolation, even if surrounded by crowds. That isolation becomes the breeding ground for collapse, not always morally, but structurally, emotionally, spiritually. Influence becomes too heavy to carry alone, and without accountability to share the weight, the entire thing begins to crumble under its own pressure. In environments where influence is prized but accountability is absent, culture suffers. People operate in fear rather than freedom. Ideas are stifled. Mistakes are hidden instead of addressed. The organization, the community, or the movement begins to rot from the inside out. It still looks functional from the outside, but beneath the surface, discontent, confusion, and resentment grow. Eventually, the collapse isn't just personal, it's systemic. And when the influential figure falls, they often take many down with them. Reputations are damaged, trust is broken, the cause they once championed becomes suspect, and the tragedy is that much of this is avoidable. If accountability had been honored, leaders often don't reject accountability outright. They simply resist it subtly. They delay meetings with those who ask hard questions. They surround themselves with admirers instead of equals. They elevate loyalty over honesty, and slowly they lose the ability to hear anything that disrupts their comfort. But a leader who cannot be questioned will eventually be disqualified, not necessarily by others, but by the weight of their own unchecked influence. For influence to be sustainable, it must be accompanied by vulnerability. The leader must be willing to say, "I need help," or "I got that wrong." They must invite others into the process, not just to affirm, but to advise, to critique, to balance. This doesn't weaken the leader, it strengthens them. It shows maturity, it builds credibility, it creates a culture where others are free to do the same, where honesty is modeled at the top and flows through the entire system. People are drawn to influence. It's natural. We are inspired by those who speak boldly, act decisively, lead visibly. But what people stay for, what builds loyalty, what creates legacy, is not just influence, it's integrity. And integrity can't survive in the absence of accountability. It needs space to be tested, voices to challenge it, and structures that protect it. When influence grows faster than character, accountability is the bridge that keeps both in step. Without it, the gap widens until collapse is the only possible outcome. There is also a cultural dynamic at play. We live in a time when followers often contribute to the lack of accountability. We idolize influencers, spiritual leaders, executives, or public figures. We project onto them what we want to see. We defend them from critique. We excuse behavior that would never be tolerated in others. This creates a feedback loop where the leader begins to believe the illusion and the followers enable it. Breaking that loop requires courage, not just from the leader, but from the community around them. It requires a collective commitment to truth over image, to values over personalities. Influence in its purest form is not about control, it's about service. It's about using the platform one has been given to uplift others, to advance good, to speak truth. But when influence is divorced from accountability, it becomes performative. The focus shifts from impact to impression, from substance to style, and eventually from purpose to survival. The leader begins to serve the brand instead of the mission, and the collapse, though it may not be immediate, becomes assured. Accountability should be baked into the DNA of influence, not as a checklist, but as a culture. It should be visible in how decisions are made, how dissent is handled, how feedback is received. It should be welcomed, not feared. Because when accountability is embraced, it acts like scaffold, supporting the influence while it's being built, keeping it aligned, holding it steady during storms. When the scaffolding is removed prematurely, the entire structure is at risk. Those with true influence understand this. They don't resist accountability, they seek it. They build it into their rhythm. They elevate voices who disagree with them. They measure success not just by impact, but by alignment with values. They lead with transparency, not just strategy. And when correction comes, they don't run from it. They lean into it, knowing it's part of what keeps their leadership honest and their influence healthy. The most dangerous moment for an influencer is not when they are criticized. It's when they are beyond criticism. It's when they are insulated by their own success, surrounded by those who benefit from their image, unable to discern feedback from attack. In that moment, collapse is no longer a possibility. It is a trajectory. Accountability is the only force strong enough to interrupt that trajectory. Even the most gifted leaders, without accountability, will eventually make decisions that hurt the very people they were called to serve. Not always out of malice, but out of blind spots and unchecked assumptions. Influence gives them reach. Accountability gives them grounding. And when the two work together, the result is leadership that is both effective and enduring. Every leader must ask, who can tell me the truth? Who has the access and the trust to correct me when I stray? who is close enough to see behind the curtain and courageous enough to speak when others remain silent. These are not signs of weakness. They are the evidence of wisdom. They are what separate leaders who last from those who implode. Influence is a gift, but like all gifts, it comes with responsibility. The responsibility to steward it well, to guard it from distortion, to anchor it in truth, and above all, to submit it to a higher authority, one that cares more about character than charisma, more about people than platform, more about lasting impact than short-term applause. Without that submission, without that accountability, the weight of influence eventually becomes too great to bear. And what was meant to lift others ends up collapsing under its own unchecked power. The stability of any leadership construct is inextricably tied to the source of its authority, and when that source is perceived to be divine, the implications of betrayal or deviation from that origin carry profound systemic consequences. The removal of individuals from positions of authority, particularly those operating under the assumption of divine appointment or spiritual mandate, can therefore signal a moment not only of institutional recalibration, but of covenantal breach. It is within this context that the principle emerges: no one is above the mission. Leadership is functional, not ornamental. It exists to advance purpose, not to preserve personality. In historically theocratic or mission-driven environments, authority is delegated, not originated, and must remain subordinate to the principles and vision that define the mission. The erosion begins when the individual conflates personal identity with the mission itself, assuming an irreplaceability that destabilizes succession planning, accountability, and the capacity for adaptive change. The psychological transition from servant of the mission to embodiment of the mission is subtle but profoundly consequential. Once a leader believes that the organization, movement, or nation cannot function without their continued oversight, the governance model shifts from principled stewardship to autocratic preservation. In this framework, the mission must always remain supreme. It is the immutable reference point against which all actions, policies, and decisions must be measured. When individuals, regardless of prior accomplishments or charisma, begin to operate as though their presence is indispensable, the integrity of the mission is compromised. Structural safeguards must be instituted to ensure that leadership remains an office, not an identity. This distinction is fundamental in preventing systemic dysfunction, particularly within movements founded upon ideals larger than any one figure. The precedents for this are not merely theoretical, but observable across political, religious, and corporate history. Consider the construct of succession in long-standing institutions. Whether in monarchical systems governed by divine right, religious orders organized under ecclesiastical hierarchy, or democratic governments where leadership is ideally derived from the consent of the governed. In each case, the transference of authority is facilitated by the recognition that no individual, however gifted or successful, can exceed the architecture of the system itself. When this principle is violated, the resultant fragility often leads to abrupt collapse, schism, or even civil conflict, all of which point back to a fundamental misalignment between leader and mission. Moreover, in environments where the mission is grounded in moral or spiritual conviction, the leader's fidelity to that moral structure must remain under continuous scrutiny. The moment that loyalty to the individual supersedes loyalty to the founding principles, the institution begins to cannibalize its own credibility. Staff, followers, or citizens may adopt a posture of uncritical allegiance out of fear, admiration, or dependency, But this creates a closed feedback loop in which dissent is interpreted as disloyalty rather than as a vital mechanism of reform. The mission, once transcendent, becomes a tool for consolidating personal power. One of the most evident dangers of positioning an individual above the mission is the suppression of institutional memory and cultural evolution. Innovation and critical dialogue become casualties of a leadership model that tolerates no variance from the central personality. As a result, the mission itself is stagnated, confined to the interpretative framework of one voice, rather than allowed to grow through collaborative engagement and the inclusion of diverse perspectives. Organizations or movements so structured inevitably face generational decline, as emerging leaders are not cultivated to serve the mission, but only to replicate or protect the founding figure's legacy. In legal and governance terms, this dynamic often manifests as a centralization of power, erosion of checks and balances, and the collapse of participatory processes. The rule of law, or in religious contexts, adherence to sacred texts or doctrine, is subordinated to the pronouncements of the leader. This leads to procedural anomalies, including the circumvention of established norms, revisionist narratives to justify current behavior, and a culture in which truth becomes malleable. In such cases, removal from power is not merely punitive, it becomes a necessary realignment to restore the supremacy of the mission over the identity of its steward. It is essential to recognize that this principle does not negate the importance of strong, visionary leadership. On the contrary, it affirms the need for leaders whose authority is derived from their alignment with the mission. The distinction lies in the source of legitimacy. Authority is earned and maintained not by charisma or tenure, but by adherence to the purpose for which the leadership role was created. This understanding introduces a profound discipline into the leadership model, requiring constant recalibration, humility, and a willingness to submit one's personal ambition to a collective mandate. In practical terms, this often requires institutions to formalize systems of accountability that function independently of personality. Transparent evaluation metrics, term limits, peer reviews, and advisory boards can serve to insulate the mission from undue personalization. Likewise, the cultivation of a leadership pipeline ensures that the mission is not imperiled by the departure of any single figure. In spiritually rooted systems, this may involve theological reaffirmation of the mission's divine origin, thereby discouraging any attempt to conflate the messenger with the message. The social and psychological dynamics at play are also significant. Followers often internalize the values of the leader, particularly when that leader is perceived to be acting under divine or moral mandate. This can result in a collective identity crisis when the leader is removed or challenged. Thus, part of the responsibility of mission-driven leadership is to decentralize influence, ensuring that the community's loyalty is directed toward shared values rather than toward any singular expression of them. When followers are educated to uphold the mission independently of any one figure, the structure becomes resilient, capable of weathering transitions without existential disarray. This principle also has implications for conflict resolution and institutional recovery. When a leader is removed due to misalignment with the mission, the process must be guided not by vengeance or political expediency, but by a sober reaffirmation of the mission itself. The goal is not to destroy the legacy or persona of the former leader, but to reinforce the enduring nature of the mission that supersedes them. In some cases, this may involve public clarification of principles, structural reforms, or restorative dialogue, all intended to re-anchor the institution in its foundational purpose. Finally, this conceptual framework offers a model for ethical leadership training. Emerging leaders must be taught from the outset that their role is instrumental, not ultimate. They are facilitators of a vision that predates and outlasts them. This cultivates a sense of stewardship rather than ownership. It also prepares them to lead with open hands, ready to relinquish the role if their continued presence ever jeopardizes the mission. Such a posture, while countercultural in many competitive or hierarchical environments, is the hallmark of sustainable influence. It prevents the corrosion of vision under the weight of ego, and ensures that the mission remains protected, even from those who once served it most faithfully. When God removes a leader, it is never random. It is intentional, strategic, and purposeful. It is not the product of chaos, but of order reasserting itself, even if the removal appears sudden or controversial to the human eye. This kind of divine shift often signals that something critical has transpired, either within the leader, within the people, or within the mission itself, that necessitates intervention. And it is precisely because leadership carries influence, authority, and spiritual consequence that its removal is so weighty, so revealing. It points not only to the failure or fulfillment of a season, but to a deeper recalibration taking place beyond the visible surface. Leadership that begins with a divine call must also remain tethered to divine standards. When a leader begins to drift, subtly or overtly, from those standards, they do not simply compromise their own integrity. They compromise the mission they were entrusted to steward. And divine removal in this context is not vindictive, it is surgical. It is the separating of mission from personality, of covenant from convenience. It is a recalibration that says, this mission matters more than this moment. This cause matters more than this figure. Because while people may elevate a leader, God protects the integrity of the mission. The signs of divine removal are often misunderstood. It does not always come with scandal. Sometimes it comes with silence. A sudden lack of clarity, a drying up of influence, an erosion of trust that cannot be traced to any one action, but becomes unmistakable over time. What once flowed freely begins to cease. What once drew crowds now feels strained. These are not just political consequences or branding issues. They are spiritual indicators that the grace once assigned to the role has been lifted. And when that grace lifts, no amount of strategy, charisma, or institutional loyalty can restore it. Because the issue is not about optics, it's about alignment. Sometimes the removal is public. Other times it is internal long before it becomes visible. The leader may still be in position physically, but spiritually the authority has shifted. The weight of the mantle is no longer present. The prophetic edge is dulled. The discernment is confused, and those who are spiritually attuned can feel it. They may not be able to articulate it at first, but they sense the vacuum. They sense that something has changed, that the one who once led with divine clarity is now leading with human calculation. And over time, what was hidden becomes exposed, not always through dramatic fallout, but through a slow disintegration of credibility and spiritual resonance. God removes leaders not simply because they sin, but because they refuse to realign. Everyone is human and all leaders stumble, but the decisive factor is response. When conviction comes, does the leader repent or rationalize? When correction is offered, do they submit or resist? When the mission and their own ego come into conflict, which do they serve? It is in these decisions, often made in quiet rooms, often known only to God, that leadership is either restored or removed. Because the issue is not just behavior, it is posture. God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And when pride becomes the foundation of leadership, removal is not punitive, it is protective. This kind of divine removal is not limited to one realm. It can be seen in every domain where influence is exercised under the assumption of divine sanction, whether in political office, spiritual leadership, organizational direction, or cultural movements. The higher the influence, the greater the scrutiny, not because God is harsh, but because he is holy, and when the vessel begins to profane the calling, whether through manipulation, abuse of power, spiritual arrogance, or moral compromise, the calling remains, but the vessel is set aside. Because the calling was never about the vessel, it was about the purpose, and when the vessel ceases to serve the purpose, God moves to protect the purpose. There is often a temptation to mourn the leader more than the mission. People become attached to personalities. They equate the voice of the leader with the voice of God. They associate the success of the mission with the presence of the leader. But when God removes a leader, it is an invitation to refocus, to ask deeper questions, to examine whether the loyalty of the people was to a man or to a mandate, whether the structure was built on obedience or celebrity, and often God allows the removal to provoke this kind of soul searching, to purify the community, to disentangle the sacred from the familiar, to remind the people that the mission continues even when the face of the mission changes. It is not uncommon for a leader to resist removal, to attempt to hold onto influence even when the authority has lifted. This produces a dissonance that eventually affects everything they touch. Decisions become reactive instead of visionary. Relationships fracture. A spirit of control begins to manifest, and the very people the leader was once called to serve become tools to protect the position. This is tragic but common, because when identity is rooted in role rather than in obedience, removal feels like annihilation rather than redirection. The leader believes they are fighting for righteousness, but in truth they are fighting for relevance, and the longer they resist, the more painful the removal becomes, not just for them, but for those around them. When God removes a leader, it is also a test for the people. Will they continue in the mission, or will they be paralyzed by nostalgia? Will they listen for the next voice God raises up, or will they idolize the last voice he set down? The removal of a leader is never just about the leader. It's about the whole community. It reveals whether the people have discerned the mission or merely followed the personality, and it offers a moment of recentering, of repentance, of renewed clarity. Because the mission was never meant to be sustained by charisma, it was meant to be stewarded by those who walk in obedience. It is important to recognize that divine removal does not negate past fruit. A leader who is removed may have once been greatly used. Their influence may have been legitimate, their calling authentic, but seasons change, and faithfulness in one season does not guarantee exemption in the next. God honors what was done in alignment, but he does not tolerate what is done in rebellion. This distinction helps the community honor the past without excusing the present. It allows for gratitude without idolatry. And it affirms that God's work is not dependent on any one person, however instrumental they once were. There is a mercy in divine removal that must not be overlooked, because often the leader is being spared from a deeper fall. What seems like a demotion may actually be a deliverance. What appears as loss may in fact be an invitation to repentance, rest, and healing, but this only becomes clear to those who yield, to those who recognize that their identity is not in the title, but in their obedience to the one who called them. And when they surrender to the removal, rather than fight it, they often find that God is not discarding them, but restoring them, reorienting them, reassigning them to a new season with new grace. For those observing the removal, there is also a call to humility. It is easy to criticize, to speculate, to celebrate downfall. But if God has removed someone, the appropriate response is reverence, not ridicule, because leadership is sacred, and its removal is a moment to reflect, not to gloat. It is a moment to examine our own hearts, to ask whether we too have drifted, whether we too have assumed permanence where only stewardship was ever granted. It is a moment to recommit ourselves to the mission, not just in word, but in action. The removal of a leader by divine hand is not the end of the mission. It is a declaration that the mission is still holy, still active, still worth protecting. It is a reminder that God will not allow the sacred to be hijacked by ego or the prophetic to be diluted by ambition. And it is an opportunity for the next generation to rise, not in rebellion but in reverence, to learn from the past, to honor what was done well, to avoid the pitfalls, and to step forward with clean hands and a pure heart, ready to carry the mission further than one person ever could alone.